Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the past speak to you in a soft voice. Because tonight we will travel to a corner of Virginia, where silence became an accomplice and desire was paid for with blood. On that cold November night in 1844, the state's most respected judge discovered something that would end 3 lives and destroy the reputation he had built stone by stone. William Augustus Jerome, a magistrate with a firm voice and spotless reputation, never imagined that horror would be born under his own roof. His wife, Elizabeth, crossed the fog-wrapped courtyard with a candle trembling between her fingers. The wind made it flicker as if it hesitated to light up what was coming. She pushed open the stable door, expecting to find her husband in a business meeting, perhaps discussing votes or contracts with some local politician. But what she saw in the dim light smelled of sweat, shame, and something deeper than sin. There was her husband on top of Marcus, the 23-year-old slave she had seen 1,000 times stay quiet when given orders. The young man said nothing, his gaze fixed on the beams, tears slowly running down his face, as if his soul was escaping drop by drop. The judge, however, murmured words he had never said to his wife, whispering "I love you" with a desperation that split the air in two. Elizabeth didn't scream, didn't collapse. Her silence was colder than the night dot in her chest. Anger wasn't born against her husband, but a blind, burning hatred toward the wrong man. Weeks later, the same stable would wake up with 2 lifeless bodies and a secret sealed for generations. No one ever knew the whole truth of Virginia's darkest scandal, but to understand how an obsession destroyed 2 innocent people and slowly killed a third over 12 years, we must go back even further to March 1832, when the story was just beginning to grow. It was spring in Fairfax County. The air smelled of dogwood flowers, and the breeze carried the song of mockingbirds hidden in the ancient oaks. To the west stretched the Shenandoah Valley, fertile and rolling. To the east, the chaos of Washington, less than 30 miles away. It was a world split in 2. Gentlemen farmers who quoted Cicero while whipping the men who belonged to them. Politicians who proclaimed freedom while living off others' sweat. Churches full of believers who saw no problem between Christian love and the whip. William Harav was 32 years old then, recently named circuit judge after 6 years as a prosecutor. Tall, with a tense body more from anxiety than strength, dark hair cut with military precision, clean-shaven when others wore fashionable beards. His grey, cold eyes didn't look, they scanned. Those who dealt with him described him as a genius without a soul, able to take apart laws but unable to offer a sincere smile. In 1829 he had married Elizabeth Thornton, an alliance as strategic as it was emotionally empty. She came from an important Richmond family, brought an $8,000 dowry and a last name that opened doors in the rooms where destinies were decided. They married when she was 27 years old, an almost scandalous age for a first-time bride. She was a woman with sharp features, a clever gaze, and practical manners. She knew marriage was a transaction and accepted her role with dignity. They had 3 children in a row. William, Catherine, and Robert. Elizabeth managed the house with the efficiency of a clock, organized dinners, kept up appearances, and never complained about her husband's absences. If she noticed that he avoided her bed or touched her with the coldness of duty, she stayed quiet. In her world, silence was a virtue. That same year, the judge owned 12 slaves, enough to maintain his 300 acres and show his status. Among them, he was seen as a correct master. He didn't waste cruelty, but he didn't show kindness either. He fed, punished, and judged. He believed that being less brutal than others made him a fair man. He didn't understand that decency isn't measured by comparison to barbarism. His professional reputation grew. He was careful in processes, tough in applying the law. He could free a slave if the formalities required it, and at the same time order deadly whippings for anyone who dared to run away. On paper, he was the model of order. In his soul, just an emptiness that would soon seek to be filled in the most forbidden way. The law was the law, changeable, impersonal, sacred in Judge Jareth's mind. Feelings had no place in his courtroom, or his conscience. His absolute respect for precedents and procedures had earned him a reputation for justice. Though not for warmth, he was the type of man other lawyers could predict. And in a world of ambitions and intrigues, being predictable was a luxury. But under that armor of legalism slept a secret so dangerous that if known, it would have destroyed him completely. Since his teenage years, William had felt an attraction he never dared to name. Not for women, never for women. His marriage to Elizabeth was nothing more than a necessary disguise. A survival ceremony to fit into a society that would have burned his true nature alive. He had believed that sharing a bed, house, and last name with a respectable wife could cure him, or at least distract him. But closeness to a woman only made his inner condemnation worse. The more he pretended, the more unbearable the emptiness became. So he took refuge in the only thing he could control, work. He became a human clock, reviewing cases until dawn, traveling between counties, reading sentences with almost mechanical precision. He avoided parties, dinners, every place where a male gaze could light the spark he so feared. He never allowed his eyes to linger more than an instant on another man. He built wall after wall until he forgot what was inside, and when the loneliness weighed too much, he told himself this was just life, that everyone acted, that everyone lied a little to keep breathing, until one March morning in 1832, Marcus arrived. He was born on a North Carolina plantation in 1821, son of a slave woman named Rachel and a white overseer who never acknowledged him. From the first day, his light skin and fine features placed him in no man's land. Too light to be accepted by other slaves, too black to be considered human by whites. He lived in the in-betweens, but always watched. He grew up inside the master's house, not in the fields, learning to read secretly by copying the white children's lessons. He couldn't know then that this gift, his education, his quiet elegance, his careful presence would also be his downfall. What made him useful would make him vulnerable, and what set him apart would condemn him to be desired and then punished by age 11. He had already learned the only lesson that ensured survival. Don't look, don't speak, don't feel. Become a shadow that obeys before being called, a body without a face. At 10, he lost his mother to a fever, and with her, the only protection the world had offered him. He was sold the following year to pay off the owners. Gambling debts between ages 11 and 20, he changed masters 7 times. Always the same pattern. They bought him for his education and manners. They put him to serve in the rooms where white visitors were received. And when the master's wife noticed her husband's glances, the whispers began. There were no direct accusations, but the rumor was enough. Marcus was sold again, quickly, quietly. Before shame touched the front door, he learned that nothing was certain, not kindness, not promises, not silence. He learned that white men took what they wanted and then blamed him for provoking it. He learned to survive by feeling nothing, and when Judge Jarev paid $50 for him at a Richmond market, Marcus was already an expert at disappearing. The judge explained the purchase to his wife as a domestic necessity. His new position required formal dinners, important visitors, staff with refined manners. Elizabeth agreed. They needed help. Marcus arrived at the house at 11 years, old and slipped between its walls. Like a ghost who learned quickly, he obeyed without speaking, listened without looking, worked with a perfection that felt uncomfortable. Elizabeth considered him competent, though strangely distant. The other slaves saw him as out of place, too polished, too quiet, too white to be one of them. They didn't know that this voiceless child was already a survivor, and that silence in this house would soon become his deepest prison. During the first months, the judge barely noticed Marcus. To him, Marcus was just another item in the household inventory, a silent tool among many. But in September 1832, 4 months after his arrival, something broke that night. William returned late from a court session in Alexandria. The house was asleep. Only the chirping of insects and the brush of wind against the prushues accompanied his steps. He carried a lantern in his hand when he turned toward the stable. His horse had shown a slight limp that morning, and concern led him there. The trembling light woke Marcus, who was sleeping in the loft with other slaves, still half asleep. He came down the wooden ladder to offer help, thinking something urgent was happening. It was then, under the damp breath of the stable and the yellow flicker of the lantern, that the judge saw what he should never have seen. Marcus, with his shirt unbuttoned to the chest, his hair messy and his eyelids heavy with sleep, seemed different. Removed from the stiffness he showed during the day, his vulnerability made him beautiful. In that instant, William felt all the walls he had built with discipline and fear come crumbling down. For the first time, it wasn't an abstract thought, but a physical, burning current, desire. A real, immediate, tangible desire. He stood frozen, trapped by himself, his heart racing. Marcus, confused by the master's silence, asked if something was wrong. The judge stammered a denial and left quickly, leaving behind the smell of oil and shame. He didn't sleep that night, his body trembling, his eyes open, repeating to himself that it had been a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But the thought returned again and again, like an echo that doesn't fade. And so the obsession began, not with an act, but with a look. 32 years of denial melted in a single second. And the most dangerous part, the object of his desire was legally his. He couldn't refuse, couldn't speak, couldn't exist outside his will. The monstrosity of that idea didn't stop him. On the contrary, it turned it into a justification. For 3 months, William didn't touch Marcus, but he watched him with the sick devotion of someone who believes they love. He looked for excuses to see him: nighttime inspections, extra tasks, absurd orders that kept him close. He pretended normalcy in front of his wife, but inside his head, he wove a story that excused him. He didn't see himself as a predator, but as a tragic man, victim of a forbidden love, and that mental story made him more dangerous than any of the masters Marcus had before. Marcus, who already knew that language of looks, understood what was coming. He doubled his caution, avoided being alone with the judge, worked to the limit of perfection, stayed invisible. He didn't sleep well, He heard every creak of the floor, every footstep in the hallway, every foreign breath. His body reacted before his mind. Air got stuck, his pulse quickened, his stomach tightened. What today we would call anxiety devoured him in silence, but no one noticed anything. His face was a perfect mask, his silence, his armor. No one in that house knew they were watching the beginning of a tragedy that would last. 12 years a story that didn't begin with a crime, but with the desire of a man who confused power with love. On December 18th, 1832, the judge decided to act. He sent a message. Marcus must appear at the stable. After midnight, under the excuse of an urgent matter, Marcus understood immediately. He had lived this before. He knew that resistance only meant punishment, sale, or something worse. Only one way out remained. Obey in that world, for men like him. There was never a third option. The stable that December night seemed like a frozen tomb. Frost covered the beams. The horse's breath condensed into clouds that floated heavily over the darkness. And a single candle, tiny and trembling, threw long shadows that moved as if they had life. The air smelled of wet hay, leather, and fear. That smell would be forever engraved in Marcus's memory, tied to terror like an invisible scar. Outside, Virginia's winter had silenced all sound. No one would hear anything. No one would come if he screamed. Marcus was alone, completely alone, with the man who controlled his body, his destiny, and even his breath. What happened there was rape. There is no other possible word. The sweet words the judge murmured, the promises, the I love yous that confused reality changed nothing. There was no shared desire. Only fear, only power, when refusing meant punishment or death, will cease to exist. Marcus didn't fight, didn't cry, didn't beg. He disconnected from the world, as he had learned to do in other moments of pain. He fixed his gaze on a crack in the ceiling, breathed like a machine, let his body become lifeless, except for the involuntary reactions that would so confuse his attacker. His mind hid in a place where the judge couldn't reach him. When it was all over, William felt euphoric. He believed he had broken his chains, that he had finally been honest with himself. He looked at Marcus and didn't see a victim, but a silent lover. He interpreted the stillness as acceptance, the immobility as surrender. He spoke to him with sick tenderness, promised him privileges, assured him this was love. Marcus nodded without words, just waiting to be allowed to leave. He climbed to the loft and stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying not to exist. From that night on, the horror became routine. 2, 3 times a week, sometimes more. The judge had him called with any excuse, the same scenario, the same script that William remained convinced it was love, and Marcus kept learning to disappear. The abuse was constant, methodical, devastating. Marcus's body responded with reflexes that the judge interpreted as desire, and that confusion became torture. He couldn't resist without risking his life. He couldn't run without condemning himself. He couldn't even show his true face without fearing worse punishment. So he perfected his art of not feeling. He reached a point where his own mind no longer knew how to tell the difference between being alive or turned off. Only one thread kept him tied to humanity. His younger brother, Daniel, born in 1829, 8 years after Marcus, from the same mother's womb and another white father. Daniel had remained in North Carolina when Marcus was sold. For years, Marcus knew nothing about him. He believed him lost, dead, erased from the map of slavery. But in 1836, through a chain of cruel coincidences, Daniel was also sold and ended up on a plantation just 10 miles from the Jarrah estate. The enslaved maintained their own secret system of communication rumors, hidden messages, voices that crossed fields and rivers without leaving a trace. Through that invisible thread, Marcus learned that his brother was alive. They began sending each other brief coded messages, pieces of hope disguised as routine. Knowing Daniel was still alive became his only reason to resist. Every time the judge called him, every time the horror repeated, Marcus thought of his brother and found the minimum strength to keep breathing. But in 1837, William discovered those messages, and he didn't forbid them. Not yet. He understood he had in his hands the perfect tool to completely dominate Marcus. He told Marcus that if he ever disobeyed, if he ever refused or showed resistance, he would have Daniel sold to hell to a sugar plantation in Louisiana where slaves died within a few years, or to the cotton fields of Mississippi where bodies were consumed to the bone. From that day on, Marcus understood that his silence not only protected Hemet, was the only barrier between his brother and death. That threat changed everything until then. Marcus had obeyed out of fear of his own punishment. But from that moment on, he did it out of love and terror combined to protect Daniel from a fate he didn't deserve. William had found the only vulnerable point in the heart of the man he claimed to possess, and he turned it into a weapon. He congratulated himself on his cleverness, convinced that his manipulation was a form of deep understanding, a show of love in his sick mind. He saw himself as a generous lover who offered reasons for surrender, not as a master who raped. He repeated to himself that he didn't force Marcus, that Marcus participated because he wanted to. His mind wove fictions so dense they erased the truth. He called them attentions, tenderness, mutual affection. He wrote verses about the double soul they shared, keeping them in private notebooks that decades later would leave. Historians confused by their tone of self-pity and delusion. In his twisted logic, Marcus's stillness, his lack of visible fear, his perfect silence were proof of love, not trauma. Marcus had accepted nothing. He had simply learned to absent himself with surgical precision. During the encounters, his mind fled far away. He counted the ceiling beams, recited the prayers his mother taught him before she died, or mentally composed letters to his brother, promising himself that someday they would see each other. Again, his body reacted through natural reflexes that the judge interpreted as desire. Marcus felt nothing, or he felt everything with such intensity that the only way to survive was to turn off. Completely the years passed. William rose in his career. His reputation grew. He was the judge who spoke against the worst abuses of slavery, the humanitarian man who preached moderation. He didn't see the irony that he could condemn a brutal overseer for excessive whipping and then spend the night, destroying Marcus's mind without blinking. He considered himself a moral pillar, a just man, while repeating crimes wrapped in poetry. Elizabeth noticed the emptiness between them, but she couldn't name it. Since 1833, intimacy had died. He praised her for her good management of the household. She cared for their children, kept up appearances, and that facade was enough to silence suspicions. Among the wives in her circle, she consoled herself thinking she had seen worse husbands, gamblers, drunks, men who kept illegitimate children with slave women. At least hers was discreet, on the plantation. Silence was the rule. The other enslaved people had noticed the judge's unusual attention to Marcus, but no one dared mention it. When a man named Joshua quietly hinted at something about the nighttime visits to the stable, he was sold before the week ended. No one spoke again. Marcus grew from an 11-year-old boy to a 23-year-old man, strong, with precise movements, but with an empty look that disturbed everyone. He ate apart, worked apart, avoided all unnecessary conversation. Several women tried to approach him. He remained stone-faced. He lived in a state of constant waiting, as if he awaited something even he couldn't name. Daniel, his brother, was now 15 years old. Through the same secret system of messages, Marcus knew the boy was serving as an apprentice in a nearby house, repeating his own destiny. Educated, useful, vulnerable, fear ate at Marcus. He couldn't warn him, couldn't save him. He could only keep enduring the nights in the stable to keep him alive. Then, on November 3rd, 1844, William arrived with new information. He told Marcus that the plantation where Daniel lived was going to be sold. The slaves would be auctioned to different owners. Daniel, because of his training as a house servant, would be bought by a rich master, separated from the others. William offered himself as savior. He could arrange for Daniel to be bought by him. Keep the brothers together. He asked only one thing in return: that Marcus showed more enthusiasm in their encounters, that he pretend love, that he smile while sinking. This was the escalation Marcus had always feared. It was no longer enough to endure. Now he had to act, pretend desire, fake love, offer gestures and words he didn't feel. William wanted more than obedience. He wanted participation. He wanted Marcus to look him in the eyes, to touch him of his own accord, to say affectionate phrases he had invented. He had spent 12 years convinced that Marcus's silence was shyness, not trauma. He believed the young man only needed encouragement to express the feelings that, in his fantasy, had been growing for years. Marcus spent 3 days without sleeping, trying to decide what to do. If he kept refusing, Daniel would be sold, lost forever, but pretending affection seemed impossible. He had survived by deactivating every emotion. His body knew how to be quiet, not how to fake love. On November 6th, he tried. He looked at the judge, forced a voluntary touch, searched for sweet words that came out empty, his voice flat, his skin rigid, his gaze dead. William, accustomed to the stillness he interpreted as acceptance, couldn't stand that cold pretense. For the first time in years, he became furious. He accused Marcus of mocking him, of playing with him, of denying what they shared. He demanded to know why. Marcus couldn't simply accept his love, and for the first time in 12 years, Marcus spoke not with screams, but with a broken murmur, looking not at the judge, but at the wall. I don't want this. I never have. Every time you touch me, I want to die. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to stop the air. William watched him with a mix of surprise and emptiness, as if he had just heard an unknown language. For an instant, something like understanding crossed his gaze, and then it went out, because accepting those words meant accepting that for 12 years he had been a rapist, that every encounter had been violence, that his love story was a lie, that he was a monster. William couldn't allow that, so he twisted reality once more. He told Marcus he was confused, that he was afraid of his feelings, that abuse from other masters had damaged him so much he no longer recognized true affection. He spoke with false tenderness, explaining with condescending patience what Marcus really felt. Marcus understood then that there was no way out, that William would never free him, would never see the truth, that he was trapped forever in the sick mind of his master. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something, not anger, not hatred, but a deep, inhuman exhaustion, a weariness that emptied his soul. 2 days later, on November 8th, William announced he had managed to buy Daniel. He would arrive in a few days. "You should be grateful," he said. "I've made great efforts to keep you together. Having your family close will make you happy, more willing to appreciate what you have." Marcus didn't respond. What could he say? His brother was coming toward this hell, toward the same place where his life had been destroyed. Daniel was 15 years old, almost 16, the same age Marcus had been when it all began. They looked too much alike. Marcus knew it. He knew what would follow. On November 10th, while cleaning the stable to receive him, Elizabeth Jarov began to watch. For weeks she had noticed something out of place. Her husband's constant excuses to go out at night. His way of looking at the slave with disturbing intensity. The nights he murmured Marcus's name in his sleep. Something inside her told her that her husband's real secret slept in that frozen stable, and she was determined to discover it. Elizabeth wasn't naive. She had grown up among the silent rules of slavery. She knew white men took black women when they wanted, and society covered it with a blanket of hypocrisy. They lamented quietly, but accepted it as part of the natural order. What disturbed Elizabeth wasn't the existence of abuse, but the nature of her husband's behavior. She saw him as different. It wasn't the occasional appetite of men of his class, but something more intense, obsessive, almost devoted, and though her mind refused to form the suspicion, the thought haunted her. It looked like love, but that was absurd. William was a respected judge, a man of spotless reputation, the father of her children. He couldn't be. Still, Elizabeth was too practical to ignore the signs. If something improper was happening, she had to know, not out of compassion for Marcus. After all, he was just property in her world, but to protect what really mattered: the Jarov name, the future of her children, the social position that sustained them. So she began to watch from her second-floor window, the one facing the stable courtyard, between barely parted curtains. She mentally noted the schedules, the movements, the excuses. The first night of surveillance was November 11th. She wrapped herself in a dark shawl to avoid reflecting light and waited. At 11:30, she saw her husband's figure cross the back garden with a lantern in hand. His step was determined, that of a man heading to urgent business. Yet there was no emergency, no sick horse, no noise to justify that visit. Elizabeth watched the light flicker in the stable window for 47 minutes. She counted every one. Inside, shadows of 2 bodies moved on the walls, one taller, one slimmer. Sometimes they merged, sometimes they separated. She couldn't make out faces, but something in the rhythm of the movements made her feel an ancient cold in her stomach. When William came out, his clothes were wrinkled, his hair damp. He stood outside for a few minutes, breathing deeply before returning to the house. Elizabeth pretended to sleep when he entered the bedroom. She heard him undress in silence and get into bed without a word. She kept her eyes closed, but her heart pounded violently. The next day, she repeated the scene. Same hour, same ritual. The light swaying behind the stable window. The same 2 bodies moving in the dimness. When William returned, she smelled on his clothes the sour smell of sweat mixed with something more intimate, unmistakable. That night, Elizabeth tossed in bed until dawn. On the third day, November 13th, the uncertainty became unbearable. Guesses weren't enough. She needed proof. She needed to see if she confronted him without evidence, he would deny everything and she would look like a hysterical wife. She prepared as one going to war, a dark dress, soft shoes, and a cold determination. Even beyond fear, she waited until 11 o'clock. She saw him leave again with the lantern held high, saying one of the horses was sick. A lie. They were all healthy. She waited 15 minutes. Then followed. The night air was thick, frozen, with a smell of wet earth that stuck to her skin. She approached the stable without making noise, her heartbeat drowning each step. The door was half open, and a strip of light trembled on the ground. She moved close enough to look. She expected to find him with one of the enslaved women. A predictable but tolerable humiliation. She could handle it, keep the secret, pretend normalcy. What she saw, instead, broke the very axis of her world there, under the candle throwing a yellowish light over the hay. Was her husband, Judge William Harav, on top of Marcus, his body moving with a fervor he had never shown in her bed. And in the slave's eyes open and empty she saw the reflection of something that didn't belong to desire, but to death. In that instant, she understood there was no more marriage, no respect, no future, only a truth so devastating that silence, that old virtue of the South, became unbearable. They were both partially naked. William moved with heavy gasps, murmuring words Elizabeth couldn't hear, though the meaning was unmistakable. And Marcus lay motionless, eyes fixed on the stable ceiling, tears sliding silently down his temples until they disappeared in his hair. There was no emotion on his face. His lips didn't move. No sound came from his throat. His body was there, but he himself seemed far away, suspended in some place where pain couldn't reach him. Elizabeth stood frozen. The scene didn't fit in her mind. Her husband with a man, with a slave, committing an act that if known would ruin them all, the last name, the position, the judge's career, her own security. Everything would collapse, and even in her horror, her thinking continued working with the coldness that characterized her. What she concluded wasn't that William was an aggressor, nor that Marcus was a victim, but that this young slave had seduced her husband, that he had corrupted him with cunning and appearance. She saw in Marcus's stillness not the emptiness of trauma, but the manipulator's strategy. She watched him for minutes, unable to turn away. She saw William pronounce something like, "I love you," in the slave's ear. She saw him receive nothing in return, and she transformed that silence into calculation in her mind. Marcus was guilty. That was why William had stopped touching her, why their bed was cold, and their marriage broken. That slave had stolen him from her. Anger held her upright as she backed toward the house. She couldn't confront him yet. She had to think, draw up a plan that would protect what was hers without unleashing scandal. During the following days, she watched, analyzed, waited. She saw the judge repeat his visits to the stable, saw Marcus's empty face, his mechanical movements, his absolute lack of initiative. But now she saw everything through the filter of her fury. She convinced herself the young man was playing with him, that he faked docility to keep the judge's desire alive, that he was an expert at manipulating men through weakness. She never allowed herself to imagine he was a victim. Accepting that would have been admitting her husband was a rapist, a monster, a stranger to whom she had entrusted her life and the children who slept in the upstairs rooms. It was easier to blame the slave. Just like so many other women in her world, in Elizabeth's world, blame always fell on powerless bodies. She had seen black women punished for provoking their masters, men chained for disobeying orders they barely understood. It was a form of inherited blindness, a tradition, and Elizabeth followed it to the letter. But that blindness doesn't absolve her. By November 20th, the idea had taken deep root. Bart Marcus, she thought, was the source of her disgrace. Every look she saw as an insinuation, every silence as a challenge. She watched him serve breakfast, move on autopilot, and believed she saw in that neutrality a studied provocation. She saw him shudder when the judge's hand grazed his shoulder and interpreted it as a theatrical gesture. The more obvious Marcus's pain was, the more convinced Elizabeth was of his fakeness. The human mind has a terrible talent for reinventing reality. When truth becomes unbearable, Elizabeth could have seen the dead eyes, the constant tension, the fear embedded in his gestures, but doing so would have been to destroy her own world. So she chose the lie that allowed her to survive, and that lie would lead her to crime, to 2 deaths, and to her own condemnation. Daniel's arrival changed the air of the house, as if someone had opened a window closed for years. On November 16th, he arrived in a cart loaded with trunks and straw. The squeak of wheels against the road sounded strange and bright to Marcus, who hadn't heard that sound as comfort since childhood. When he finally saw him, after 8 winters without his face, something loosened inside him, a rusted muscle that moved again. Daniel was tall for his 15 years, thin, with features that repeated Marcus's like an inherited melody, but with a liveliness that had been denied to Marcus. He ran to him, hugged him with the urgency of someone recovering what was lost. He cried and laughed in the same gesture, and Marcus, who had learned to shrink himself to fit in the shadow, returned that embrace with a pause that for him was an act of courage. He smiled for real for an instant. He felt warmth where there had only been ice, and for a few seconds, the house seemed human. Elizabeth, watching from the house, saw that scene, and in her mind another image lit up, that of the judge fixing on Daniel the same gaze he had until then reserved for Marcus. They didn't understand, none of the 3, but Daniel's arrival set an invisible timer in motion. 3 years, thought fate. 3 years before the obsession would change focus. For Marcus, his brother's presence was both anchor and wound. He knew that young face was exactly the type that had triggered William's attention when he was the same age, and a premonitory cold ran down his back. Elizabeth, however, didn't see fear in the reunion. She saw a threat in her twisted logic, which had already begun to harden like red-hot iron. Those boys were undercover seducers, agents of ruin for her family. The fact that Daniel still seemed capable of surprise and joy horrified her. They were dangerous qualities, potential claws that could scratch the jar of reputation for 1 more week. Elizabeth continued her surveillance. The house became a board and she a cold player, watching as her husband's attention, which had been fixed on Marcus, now divided into looks toward Daniel. She saw Marcus take Daniel under his wing, teaching him the tasks of house service with hands that trembled inside, trying to keep the boy away from situations where he could be alone with the judge. She saw how Daniel's initial joy began to fade, replaced by a dark intuition that his years weren't enough to name. On the morning of the 23rd, through the dimness of the stable courtyard, Elizabeth witnessed a gesture that to any casual observer would have seemed harmless. William placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, slight gesture, like someone correcting an apprentice's posture. But to her, it was the first thread of the cord with which the master began to entangle the child. Daniel showed discomfort, but didn't pull away. He couldn't. That same night, Elizabeth made a decision that, in a short time, would turn her into the executor of a logic as brutal as it was conventional in her world. She would confront Marcus, rip a public confession of moral corruption from him, the accusation any judge would respect in defense of his wife, and then, with a firm finger, she would design his elimination so it would look like an accident, a believable story told by a white woman who felt threatened by a slave. No one would doubt her word. And with Marcus out of the equation, she thought, William would return to sanity, to decency, to her bed and his role as husband. On the night of the 24th, she waited for the right moment. After dinner, when William retired to his study, Elizabeth dressed with the determination of someone about to cross a border. She hid a pistol in the folds of her dress, a weapon she had never used, but whose basic instructions she had observed in the overseer's house training. She headed to the stable with soft steps that shouldn't alert anyone. Marcus, who had spent 12 years refining a sixth sense for danger, sensed the presence before the door creaked. He stood up near the horses with a deliberately smooth face, measured voice, the usual mask of neutrality. "Ma'am, do you need something?" he said with automatic respect. She closed the door behind her, and the smell of hay mixed with the dampness of the night enveloped them. "I know what you do with my husband. I know everything." Elizabeth's voice trembled, but in that vulnerability was a cold intention. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken. What he had feared since childhood, being the spark blamed for the ruin of a white family, was finally arriving in the form of an accusation. "Ma'am, I don't understand," he replied, searching with his gaze for a thread to escape, a word that would soften the blow. "Don't lie," she cut him off, and the pistol hidden against her side seemed to weigh like a sentence in the stable, between the smell of leather and straw. The truth that Elizabeth didn't want to obey met the certainty that, according to her code, the best defense was eliminating the danger. Marcus's certainty, for his part, that his silence was no longer enough to protect the only thing that mattered to him. The scene ended there, with the silent clash of wills and with a decision in the air that promised to break the thin scab of normalcy that still covered the Jareff's life. No one imagined that from that moment such definitive consequences would sprout, that 2 deaths and a woman's fall wouldn't be the worst of the losses. The worst would be the way the truth would be buried under the convenient truth of the powerful. That's how it always happened. "Ma'am," said Marcus cautiously, his voice low, his body upright but prepared for the blow. You seduced him," Elizabeth shouted, almost on the verge of hysteria. "You used your appearance, your youth, to corrupt a decent man. You've poisoned my marriage, destroyed my family, and now you're going after your brother. Do you think I'll allow it?" Marcus could have tried to explain, tell her about the 12 years of abuse, the threats, the way he had resisted as best he could. But why? She didn't want the truth. She had already decided what her story would be. and her story had no place for his, so Marcus kept quiet and waited. Elizabeth pulled out the pistol with trembling hands. "You'll leave tonight," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll run, and when they find you, when they bring you back, I'll say you attacked me, that you tried." She couldn't say the word, but she didn't need to. "They'll kill you, and it will be your fault." Marcus looked at the weapon, then at the woman's face, then at the stable door. He could try to run, maybe reach the woods. But then what? Where would a fugitive slave survive? And Daniel would be left alone, unprotected, exposed to the same horror. "I'm not going to run," he answered quietly. "If you're going to kill me, do it." That calm confused Elizabeth. She had expected pleas, fear, promises, not that serene resignation. "You can't decide. You can't just—" The stable door burst open. Judge Jeroff appeared with a lantern in hand. He had heard the voices from the house. He saw his wife with the weapon, Marcus still as a statue, and he understood, believed he understood. "Elizabeth," he said in a controlled tone, "put down the weapon." "You knew I was here," she stammered. "I heard shouting," he replied. "What are you doing?" "What am I doing? What are you doing?" Elizabeth's fury turned toward her husband. "I've seen you, William. I've been watching you for days. I know what you've been doing with this slave. How could you do this to me, to our children, to yourself?" William went pale. 12 years of fearing being discovered, and it had finally happened. But instead of guilt, his reflex was to deny everything. "I don't know what you think you saw, but don't you dare. Don't lie to me." Elizabeth screamed. "I saw you with him, here in this stable, doing things." She didn't need to finish. The truth filled the air like invisible gas. William's face went from shock to fear to icy hardness. "Even if what you're suggesting were true, which I don't admit, how would it be Marcus's fault? His property. He has no choice. If anyone has responsibility, it would be me." It was as close as he ever came to recognizing what he was doing. He didn't call it rape. He didn't accept the difference in power. But for a second, he admitted Marcus had no will of his own. Elizabeth heard those words as if they were betrayal. "You're defending him. After what he's done to you." "He hasn't done anything." William stopped. To say more would have been to confess. Marcus watched them with strange detachment. They were arguing about his life, his body, his guilt, without looking at him, without acknowledging his presence. It had always been this way. To them, he wasn't a person, but a problem to be solved. Elizabeth made her decision. "If you won't understand, if you don't see that this man has corrupted you, then I'll force you to see. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to eliminate the temptation, and then you'll come back to your senses." She raised the pistol and aimed it directly at Marcus. William reacted without thinking. He lunged at her, trying to grab the weapon. He wasn't doing it just for Marcus, but for the scandal, for control, for the need to contain the chaos. They struggled. Elizabeth screamed. William pulled at the barrel. The fallen lantern swayed on the floor. Marcus remained motionless, watching that impossible scene. Two white people fighting to decide his fate, while he only existed in the center of the frame. He could run, but Daniel was sleeping in the barracks. He couldn't abandon him. The shot rang out. The flash lit up the wooden walls, and the air filled with smoke, fear. Silence. This is how it always worked, Marcus thought. as the stable air became dense and death seemed to perch on every beam. "Ma'am," he said in a measured voice, every word like cloth he didn't want to tear. You seduced him." Elizabeth exploded, the phrase torn in a scream that bounced between the hay and wooden walls. "You used your appearance, your youth, to corrupt a decent man. You've poisoned my marriage, destroyed my family, and now you're going after your brother. Did you think I'd allow it?" Marcus could have explained. He could have told about the 12 years of violence, the threats that hung like knives, the clumsy resistances and signs that he had done everything possible not to give in, but to whom would he tell it? Elizabeth wasn't looking for reasons. She had already carved her truth. And in that carved figure there was no place for his dot, so he fell, silent, and waited to see what she would do. Elizabeth pulled out the pistol with trembling hands, the novelty of the weapon trembling. Along with her decision, "Tonight you'll leave this property. You'll run, and when they find you and bring you back, I'll say you attacked me, that you tried." She didn't say the word that would name the violence, but it wasn't necessary. Silence completed the threat. "They'll kill you, and it will be your fault." Marcus looked first at the barrel, then at the woman's face, and finally at the half-open stable door, as if in that threshold was the thin possibility of a woods where no one would look for him. He could try to run, maybe reach the road, maybe get lost in the trees. But what future awaited a fugitive slave? Where would he find food, shelter? How would he avoid the net that always ended with white hands reclaiming him? And Daniel, his brother, was sleeping a few cabins away. Leaving him meant handing over his only human bond to unprotection. "I won't leave," Marcus said quietly. "If you're going to kill me, do it." The absolute calm of his response threw Elizabeth off. She expected crying, pleas, promises to flee any noise that showed fear, not that frozen acceptance that left her. Without gesture, "You can't decide this. You can't," she stammered, unable to find the order that would convince fate. Then the door burst open and William's figure appeared in the frame with a lantern in hand. His light cut through the dimness and showed him pale, with the expression of someone who has heard fragments and believes he understands. He saw his wife with the pistol, saw Marcus immobile as a statue, and in his brain pieces of a puzzle he didn't even want to assemble fired off. "Elizabeth," he said in a careful tone, "put down the weapon." "You knew I was here," she murmured. "I heard voices." "What are you doing?" "What am I doing?" The reply was a brutal mirror, and Elizabeth's fury turned on her husband with all the words she had been accumulating. "I've seen you, William. I've watched you for days. I know what you do with that slave. How could you? How could you do this to me, to our children, to yourself?" Paleness drained the blood from William's face. 12 years of living with the fear of discovery materialized, now in the scene before him. But fear didn't translate into repentance. It translated into denial and counterattack. "I don't know what you think you saw, but don't you don't lie to me." Elizabeth replied, her voice broken with rage. "I saw you with him, here in this stable, doing things, acts, she didn't need to finish." The evidence floated between them like a smell no one wanted to recognize. William's face passed through various masks: horror, panic, and then a hardness that formed like armor. "Even if what you're suggesting were true, which I don't admit, how would that be Marcus's fault? His property. He has no choice. If anyone bears responsibility, I would. For an instant, the closest William came to the truth. He admitted Marcus's lack of agency. He didn't say rape, didn't double down on the inequality of power, but somehow he grazed the reality that the other didn't choose. Elizabeth, however, heard betrayal. She believed her husband was placing himself on the slave's side and choosing him over her. You defend him after what he's done to us. He hasn't done anything. William stopped, because confessing would have been admitting that for years he had imposed his will under the logic of master. Marcus was there in the middle, watching the exchange with a distance he already knew. Two people were deciding about his body and his life without asking him anything, as had always happened. As if his voice had no value to them. He wasn't a person, but a problem to be solved. Elizabeth made her decision with the coldness of someone who feels the only possible repair is drastic. If William wouldn't see the corruption she saw, if he didn't understand that this man had corrupted him, then she would force him to see the consequence. She raised the pistol and aimed it directly at Marcus. I'm going to fix this. I'll eliminate the temptation, and then you'll come back to yourself. It was the phrase with which she crowned the sentence she herself believed just. William lunged without thinking, trying to snatch the weapon from her hand. He wasn't just doing it to protect Marcus, though that possibility flickered in his action, but to prevent scandal, to control the narrative, so it wouldn't turn into a murder that left dangerous questions. They struggled. Bodies collided. Elizabeth's screams filled the stable, and a lantern swung violently until it fell to the floor. Marcus, motionless at the vertex of that drama, could have left in the middle of the tumult, could have taken advantage of the chaos to run toward the darkness, but Daniel was sleeping in the quarters, and his conscience denied him flight. He wouldn't abandon his brother to the fate of white men. The shot thundered, then a sound that seemed to split the night in two, and the flash left a trail of gunpowder that smelled like an ending. Marcus could have fought. He could have torn the revolver from Elizabeth's hands. He could have tried to flee through the half-open door into the frozen night, but 12 years of brutal training had stripped him of the reaction of flesh. What happened next with Elizabeth's corpse cooling a few steps away, with the blood still fresh staining the straw, and stable wood was the final and most absolute violation of Marcus' humanity. William took him one last time. His body fell on Marcus's with the same determination he used on the bench, and whispers, declarations wrapped in rotten tenderness, fell like pins in the young man's ear, words that tore from Marcus the impulse to scream. Marcus's eyes fixed on the ceiling. They counted the beams with the calm of someone who had repeated this ritual hundreds of times. But this time the silent tears ran down his face, tangled in his hair, and his body refused to dissolve completely into nothing. This time, every second of that final degradation reached him with unbearable clarity. When William finished, he stood up with his breathing ragged and his face flushed. He picked up the weapon as one picks up a trophy, and with an impossible satisfaction, as if that affront beside his wife's lifeless body were a romantic gesture, proof torn from life that he loved her, he said in a firmer voice, Now I can let you go. Now I have something to remember you by." Marcus lay shattered in the hay, broken in what neither time nor silence had been able to destroy before. The man who had built emotional insensibility for over a decade was finally pulverized. He couldn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the ceiling cracks and waited for the bullet that would end this endless nightmare. William raised the pistol with a trembling hand and murmured, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I loved you. I really loved you. And Marcus, with a voice that barely managed to leave his body, answered, No, you never loved me. You don't know what love is. The detonation broke space in two. The bullet went through his chest. Marcus fell backward, his blood mixed with Elizabeth's in the stable earth. He lifted his gaze one last time toward the beams he had memorized for 12 years and thought of Daniel, of his mother, of the pieces of childhood that remained before William bought him. He died in less than 2 minutes. William stood with the weapon hanging from his hand. Above the two bodies, he had killed his wife and the man he had deceived himself into believing he loved. All to protect a name, a position, a life built on lies. He should have felt something real: guilt, horror, pain, but the only thing inhabiting him was an anesthesia equal to what he had imposed on Marcus. For years, the house woke to William's screams. His account was as neat as his courtroom defense. Marcus had attacked Elizabeth and she had shot him. He had intervened, struggled, and in self-defense killed him. The other slaves confirmed the judge had been in the house and that Marcus was the only one in the stable. No one disputed the story. Why would they, if it fit their prejudices about dangerous slaves and vulnerable white women? Elizabeth was buried with full honors. William played the grieving widower with the precision of a consummate actor, and Marcus ended up in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, without public mourning or name on the tombstone. That was the justice of Virginia in 1844. But the story doesn't end there, because Daniel survived. And Daniel knew, with the certainty born of pain and memory, that his brother would never have attacked anyone. He would never have been violent. He suspected the truth, but could never prove it. When the judge looked at Daniel again with the same concentrated intensity he had previously reserved for Marcus, the young man fully understood what had happened. He couldn't flee immediately. William watched him with wary eyes, fearing he knew too much. For 3 years, Daniel endured the judge's growing attentioner, stalking that now showed itself with caution. William was more measured, more careful, not launching himself at the boy with previous haste, but Daniel saw the pattern being born again, the excuses to be alone, the looks that held longer than necessary, the care in the harassment disguised as courtesy. And by 1847, Daniel was 18 years old. His figure had matured to be even more striking than at 15, and William's obsession, dormant from fear and danger of exposure, awakened with terrifying inevitability. It began in small gestures, asking him to serve dinner in his office, requesting his presence at nighttime work sessions, a hand that lingered too long on his shoulder when giving instructions. Daniel recognized every sign like someone who has heard the same song in another voice and knows how it ends. On the afternoon of February 28, 1847, almost 3 years after Marcus's death, William called Daniel to the stable, the same stable where Marcus had died and where he had found death, and Daniel understood what that summons meant. If he went, his fate would be sealed, just like his brother's when they were alone. William spoke with calculated softness. "You look so much like your brother. Do you know how much he meant to me? How much he cared for me?" Daniel looked at him with eyes that held no illusions. And in that gaze, in that cold lucidity of someone who has seen the machinery of power up close, his decision began to form. Daniel stared at him without blinking, with the barely contained tremor of someone who has not fear but rage. "My brother died hating you. He said in a low voice, each word so cold it seemed to cut the air. Whatever you think happened between you, he hated every second. And I know you killed him. I know you killed your wife, and I know why. Judge William's face turned ashen, his eyes dilated like a cornered animal's. Don't you understand? He stammered. Marcus and I had something special, something you're too young to understand. But you will. With time you will. I'll never understand, Daniel interrupted, his voice so firm it echoed in the empty stable, though inside his heart beat violently. Because what you did with my brother wasn't love. It was torture. And I'd rather die than let you do the same to me. William's expression darkened. His tone became icy. You have no choice, Daniel. You're my property, just like Marcus was. And if you refuse, I can make your life hell. I can sell you to a place so terrible you'll beg to come back. Or his voice softened again, that hypocritical cadence he had learned to use with his victims. You can accept what I offer you. Affection, protection, a better life than most of yours. Really? Does that seem so terrible? It was the same twisted logic, the same reasoning he had used with Marcus, the same delusion of power that turned rape into affection and absolute dominion into relationship. Daniel understood in that instant there would be no more conversations, that the only way out was to act. I'd rather die running than live as you want, he said, and before William could move, he ran out of the stable. He ran without looking back, darkness devouring him while frozen air cut his lungs, his heart pounding like a war drum. He knew if they caught him, the punishment would be brutal. But he had been preparing for 3 years. He had established contacts in the underground network of slaves. He knew the safe paths, the houses where they would shelter him, the rivers he should follow north. William didn't chase him right away. He was too stunned by the rejection, too convinced Daniel would reconsider and come back, begging when he finally understood the boy had truly fled, that he had preferred the dangers of escape rather than submit. It was too late. Daniel had disappeared into the network of men and women who helped others escape toward freedom. On March 3rd, 1845, Daniel fled. He managed to reach the north, beyond Virginia, out of reach of slave catchers. He dedicated his life to the Underground Railroad, helping others escape, telling Marcus's story to anyone who would listen. Many didn't believe him. It was too horrifying, too inconceivable. Meanwhile, Judge William returned to his legal career. His reputation had been somewhat tarnished by the tragedy of his wife's death, but the public saw him as a victim. He never remarried. He never bought another young slave, whether that was from guilt or prudence. No one knew. What was discovered after his death in 1863 were his private papers, dozens of poems about Marcus, verses of love and loss, of feigned regret, of desire and ruin, poems that revealed that until the end he had believed Marcus loved him, that their relationship had been real, that his death was a tragedy that had robbed him of his only chance at happiness. He died without understanding he had been a monster, without ever accepting that what he called love was rape, without admitting that Marcus never wanted him, never chose him, that he died hating him. William took his delusions to the grave, convinced until his last breath that what happened in that stable had been passion and not abuse. But Marcus knew the truth, and Daniel carried it with him so the world wouldn't forget. In those last seconds before dying, while his gaze was lost among the ceiling beams he had counted 1,000 times, Marcus understood with exactness what had been done to him, and though the historical record would become confused over the years, though future generations would read Judge Jarev's poems and think perhaps there was complexity, that maybe there was something of love between them, Marcus knew. For 12 years he was raped by a man who called it love. And then he was murdered by that same man to protect a lie. His story shows the darkest forms of power, obsession, and self-justification, how human beings can rationalize the most monstrous acts if their image depends on it, how victims are blamed for their own suffering, how the vulnerable are sacrificed to protect the powerful. And yet, it also shows how truth survives, even when they try to bury it, sustained by those who refuse to forget. If this story has disturbed you, if Marcus's story has made you think about the countless victims who suffered and died without a voice, take a moment to subscribe and share this video. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. And comment below what you think. Do you believe Judge William really thought he loved Marcus? Or did he know what he was doing and refuse to admit it? These questions matter because versions of this same dynamic still exist today, wherever power imbalance allows some to rewrite reality for their convenience. The next time someone tells you the past was simpler, that certain problems are modern inventions, remember Marcus. Remember how 12 years of his life was stolen in the name of love. Remember how he died to protect a powerful man's reputation. Remember that human suffering isn't new, and neither is the capacity of the powerful to lie to themselves about the harm they cause. 3 years after his death, Daniel sent a letter to a northern newspaper telling his brother's story. The newspaper published a brief note, but most readers dismissed it as abolitionist propaganda. The truth was too uncomfortable to be believed. However, Daniel kept telling it again and again until some began to believe, and those few passed it on to others, and slowly, despite the judge's efforts to control the narrative, despite the convenient legal conclusions that protected his name, the truth made its way through networks of those who understood what slavery really meant, how much it cost, and whom it destroyed. Marcus's grave remains nameless on what once was the Jarev estate. Daniel died in 1891 after dedicating his life to fighting the system that had killed his brother. He never forgot, never stopped telling his story, never accepted the official version that portrayed Marcus as a violent criminal instead of a victim. That is his legacy, a painful reminder that power corrupts not only through the acts it allows, but through the lies it lets the powerful tell. That obsession disguised as love is still obsession. That calling rape by another name doesn't make it less rape, and that the dead deserve more than to have their suffering rewritten by those who caused it. Remember Marcus. Remember the 12 years he endured. Remember he died to protect his brother from the same fate. Remember that even within systems created to dehumanize, people retain their humanity, their dignity, their truth, even if that truth takes time to be heard. What do you think? Should we remember these stories even though they disturb us? Or is it better to let the past remain buried? Leave it in the comments. And if you want more true stories, historical mysteries that reveal the darkness behind respectable facades, subscribe to this channel. These stories must be told. These voices must be heard, even those that time tried to silence.